Hi, I'm Greg Watson. I'm from a company called Watson Real Estate in Palmerston North, New Zealand. And today I'm doing a live stream discussion on Blab about what to look for during a routine inspection of your residential rental property. People are welcome to join in as they go, and you may hear me respond to comments sometimes. It can seem a little strange if you're watching this on video later on. So, what to look for during a routine inspection of your rental property. Most people who look after their own properties take a very casual approach to this, both casual in terms of how often they do the inspections, but also casual in terms of how deeply they look into the things that they should be looking into. So just to elaborate a little bit, generally the building insurance policy of a home will be probably the document that will guide you as to how often you should do inspections on your residential rental property. So make sure you do them at least as often as what the insurance company says you should, or else you can be in trouble should something go wrong. But my experience with people that look after their own rental properties as opposed to having them professionally managed is that they feel somewhat uncomfortable when they do inspections. They may attend, the tenant will be home, they will ask a couple of general questions, and they'll be reluctant to have a good look at the property. Now, this is very common. It's more common than you might think. And what we find with having a third party involved in doing the inspection is that they follow a process and it is thorough, and tenants appreciate that. So just to elaborate on that, the things that we generally look for in a nutshell in an inspection is tidiness, of course, looking for damage that the tenants may or may not have done at the property. Under New Zealand tenancy law, as a landlord, you also need to be looking for hazards, things which could be a hazard to the tenants, and this can apply in other countries and in some states. You also need to be looking for breaches of tenancy law or breaches of the actual contract in place on the property. As well as that, and I'm just looking down at my notes occasionally, looking for maintenance, of course, and also any breaches of civil law, that is, civil law that in this country is crimes under the Crimes Act, for example, use of drugs, unlicensed firearms, and those sorts of things. So many owners of properties are just of the understanding that all you need to do is have a quick look at the property, make sure it looks okay, and make sure that the tenants are happy. And that's too simplistic. So let's have a look at some of these things. Let's start with tidiness, because that's the easy one. Now, under most contracts, and certainly contracts here in New Zealand, tenants have a responsibility to keep the home reasonably clean and tidy. And we hate the word reasonably in tenancy law. It's simply too open to interpretation. So this is the approach that we take. A little bit of untidiness is okay, but if it's likely to cause damage to the property, it's not okay. For example, wet washing or pot plants directly on carpet, that sort of thing is not acceptable. Having a few toys and things scattered around the house, no problem. So really what you're looking at is protecting the investment of the owner to make sure that the tidiness, and this includes gardens and grounds, is not likely to have a detrimental effect on their investment. And this leads to damage. So when you have a look through the property, a good property manager should be looking for damage. And one of the things there, for example, holes in walls, rips in curtains, cracks in windows, those sorts of things. Things that are caused by the tenant. So this is where you have an ingoing inspection of the property originally, which gives you the ground document or the base level document on the condition of the property. And then you're just looking for things like what has occurred since the beginning of this tenancy. Excuse me. So damage, let's say if there was a hole in a door or a hole in a wall, what do you do if there is damage? Well, in a routine inspection, you can spot that damage, and under tenancy law, at least in this country, you can give notice to the tenants to rectify that damage in a good and tradesman-like manner within 14 days. Failure to do so means you can take it further and look at ending the tenancy. So it's a really good idea that if you're doing regular routine inspections, that you address those issues as they occur and that you don't leave them till the end of the tenancy when there could be other issues crop up, for example, non-payment of rent and so forth. So damage, address it at the time, and don't be shy. As a landlord, you're allowed to, for example, open cupboards, look in wardrobes and so forth. You're not allowed to look in the likes of the wardrobes behind me or any items that belong, any pieces of furniture that belong to the tenants. But I remember once I went to court and the court challenged why I was looking in a cupboard of a tenant. And I said that our responsibility is to look after the property for the owner. I was looking in the cupboard, the wardrobe, to make sure there was no damage. And when I looked in that cupboard, what I found was there was damage in the ceiling space of that cupboard. In fact, somebody had installed a fan, which is commonly found if somebody's growing marijuana in a roof space. So if I hadn't looked in there, I wouldn't have known. So it's important to be thorough. Likewise with damage, you can look under mats, behind posters or pictures, and are quite entitled to do so. As I mentioned earlier, the problem with looking after property yourself and dealing directly with tenants is you don't feel comfortable doing those things, but it is really important to protect your investment. Another thing as an owner, at least under tenancy law in New Zealand, is that you need to look for hazards when you're doing a property inspection. You see, when you're a landlord in this country, it's a little bit like running your own business, where you are responsible for the hazards in that business. So let's examine this a bit further. What constitutes hazards? Well, it's really something where somebody could hurt themselves. It could be a step that's a little bit too high. It could be an electrical power point that's faulty, and so forth. So one of the roles during an inspection is to check that things are working as well as they can, and that the tenant is safe, because as landlords we have an obligation to do that. So if, for example, tenant reports that every time they flick a light switch there's a little spark, then that's something which you should not hesitate to get sorted out. So you do have a responsibility to look for hazards. And also, once you find hazards, you have a responsibility to completely eliminate them, mitigate them, reduce them, and so forth, as per health and safety law. So this doesn't actually apply in your own home that you live in, but it applies if you are renting out a home to somebody else. So you do have to have this approach to taking care of hazards. Now, another example that's quite common when it comes to hazards is rotting timber on things like decks, broken fencing with regards to swimming pools, and so forth. So if you think there's a chance someone will hurt themselves, then it's worth taking steps to reduce that. And that's what the inspection, one of the reasons for doing a routine inspection. And that leads on to the next aspect of doing a routine inspection on your rental property, which is to look for maintenance issues. Under tenancy law in this country, the tenants have a responsibility to report things that break down, but often they may not. A great thing to talk about during a routine inspection is any issues that the tenants may have with regards the maintenance of the property, things like security, bolts, whether they're secure or not, or just general maintenance issues, dripping taps and so forth. Some of these things you have a legal obligation as a landlord to put right. For example, if security is compromised through a latch that's broken, etc. Others, you do not have an obligation, for example, a dripping tap, but it's wise to do just for the protection of the house. So maintenance, so we've covered tidiness, damage, hazards and maintenance, but there's other areas that are really important to do during a routine inspection. And again, at face value, routine inspections don't seem to cover much, just a visit to the property, but there's a heck of a lot that a well-trained property manager will look for when doing an inspection. So the next one is breaches of tenancy law. In this country, the Residential Tenancies Act covers the rights and responsibilities of landlords and tenants. In some other countries, I should say, it might be the actual contractual document itself. But either way, when you're doing a property inspection, you should be looking for breaches of tenancy law. Examples of this might be that they're only allowed 2 people at a property, but it appears that there's 3 or 4. Or they're not allowed pets, but there's evidence of a dog. Could be that the lawns and gardens need to be reasonably clean and tidy, and they're not. So you're looking for breaches of tenancy law. This isn't criminal law, this is tenancy law, the breaches of the contract between the two parties. So this can be a little bit hard to spot sometimes. And a real problem with doing inspections in this country is that a landlord must give 48 hours notice. Now, if a tenant has somebody staying at the house who shouldn't be there, they can easily cover that up. If they have a pet at the property, they can fairly easily cover that up by removing it and removing all evidence, and so forth. We'll talk more about the difficulties with having to give notice when I get to the criminal activities. But tenancy law, it's really just about, and damage is another one of those where you can give them notice to rectify these things. So where you find breaches, so it's fairly obvious that more people are living there than there should be. In this country, you can give them notice. It's 14 days notice to put things right. You can come back at the end of that time, do a check, and if things aren't put right, you can take steps to end the tenancy. So as well as the things that we've talked about, there's also breaches of civil law. Now you might say, what are breaches of civil law? Really, it's just illegal activities that are under common law. For example, use of drugs, manufacture of drugs, receipt of stolen goods, and so forth. Harassment of neighbours, those sorts of things. These are things which are covered under civil law, under criminal law. However, if you're doing a routine inspection, you should be looking for these things. This goes back to the problem of having to give 48 hours notice, which means that the tenants are well and truly warned that you're coming to have a look through. So let's say that they were using methamphetamine in the house. They could easily, almost immediately, take away all of the implements and there would be no evidence in the property when the inspection is done. This is the same for receipt of stolen goods or for the manufacture of methamphetamine and so forth. Unfortunately, a limitation of being a landlord is that you must give this notice, and therefore it can be quite tricky indeed. A good thing to do is have a good relationship with the neighbours, because they're often the ones to tell you that there is a pet at the property or that there are comings and goings which indicate criminal activities at a property. So that's a little bit about what to look for during routine inspections. Just to recap: tidiness, damage, hazards, maintenance, breaches of tenancy law, and breaches of civil law. Now, a well-trained property manager will check all of these things while it's not obvious that they are doing so. And the great thing if you have a property managed is that the property manager can take a written description during the inspection, photographic description, or these days, a video to show an owner of a property. These come in really handy when you're referring to things later or talking about maintenance work to be done. So that brings me to conclude what to look for during an inspection on your rental property. Hopefully it's given a few tips as to things to be aware of, and I thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you again next time. Thanks for watching.